Studio International has come to Etchinswell in Hampshire to view Geoffrey Eastop's open studio. We had arranged to interview Eastop just after Christmas, but very sadly he passed away some days before we were due to meet, and only 3 months after his wife Pat had died. It's important to reference here that the Open Studio enterprise, which this 2015 display of Eastop's work is part, was created in 1988 by Pat Eastop, Geoffrey's wife. The Open Studios is only one of Pat's many and significant contributions to local arts, underlining her generosity and the vital role she played as a creative facilitator in Geoffrey's life and also in the lives of many other artists who she influenced through her constructive instruction and encouragement. Eastop's children have arranged this last open studio event in Etchinswell in celebration of both their father Geoffrey and their mother Pat. Ben, Geoffrey's eldest son, and his 2 sons Oliver and Luke, 2 of Geoffrey's grandsons, have made different works in film, ceramics and sculpture in homage to Geoffrey for this occasion. In this, the first of 3 short documentations to commemorate Eastop's work, Ben and his brother Tim present an overview of their father's practice. Extracts are included from the 2009 Open Studio event, when Geoffrey Eastop talked about the ideas, studios and inspirations that directed his work since he graduated from Goldsmiths College in 1952. And we see how Eastop's creative legacy has been passed to his son Ben and his grandsons Oliver and Luke.
So thank you everyone for coming today. It's been more people than we expected it. But over the last 3 months, we've had this extraordinary life back in Etchinswell, all 4 of us and all our friends. And we've really enjoyed just being back in the house that my mum created, this home, which is also the place that my father created so many wonderful new works and ideas. And so it's been a kind of reliving of our time when we were growing up with them and visiting them all the time. And we wanted very much to do this Open Studios talk one more time. Ben and his son Luke have immersed themselves in the last few months in the pottery. They've been inspired, they've been drawn in, sucked into the way that my dad thought about his practice and made his work. This intervention is how Ben's describing it. Yeah, a creative intervention. So I'm going to hand over to Ben now, and he's going to take us through the journey of my father's career in the context of my mum's home, that Dad was also a part of, but this is very much about Pat, this moment and this afternoon. So Ben, over to you. And I'll give you a 10-minute ending warning.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, these images, by the way, of Geoffrey at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So, yeah, if you start the first one, Tim. No, that's the end. That's it.
Sorry.
Yeah, good. So, for me, spending the time I have done over the last few months in my father's studio, there's been a way of remembering him and revisiting his work through making things with clay. Using materials and equipment and the glazes that he left behind in the pottery when he was there. Geoffrey was quite meticulous in keeping records. The glaze recipes, kiln firings, sketches of ideas, you may have seen some already in the pottery. So it's been for us a kind of journey of exploration really, and discovery, and an intimate way of connecting with his life.
I think the reason partly why I started thinking about a talk at all was because of so many different stages that my work passes through, and that tends to confuse people. Whereas some people are excellent potters, and now you can recognise their work because they're much more consistent than I have been. And so I want to try and explain, that's really the instigation of the church's talk, is to really try to explain to myself as much as anybody else why I moved from one kind of work to another kind of work. The method of working is much more adaptable, in my case, more flexible, and must be prepared to change. Whereas the aim, in my case again, is the same aim right from 1952, when I realised that I had to be some kind of a potter, much against my will, because I was destined to be a painter, and I still say so. But circumstances really forced me to adopt fired clay. And as soon as I did that, I realised what I'd lost. I'd lost something which I didn't want to lose, and I wanted somehow to keep it alive.
He found, you know, with ceramics, you've got a certain set of kind of rules really you have to follow, conventions more than rules, paint, there's more freedom with painting. So he saw it, you know. I think he always thought of himself as a painter, as an artist, and ceramics is what he was kind of forced into. He says that sometimes he was forced into it. So there's always that tension between trying to do with the surface as a painted surface like these pots in here, and the form. He was, you know, also aware of the sculptural possibilities of ceramics. So there's that, and I think that's what made his work interesting, really.
Did all the right thing. I got a traditional bed sitter, and I woke up every morning and got out of bed, and I looked at this canvas staring me in the face, and I thought, what on earth am I going to daub on this today? It seemed so natural when I was at college, was everybody else was daubing, it was me, and we could argue about it, what our work was about, and so on to each other, and then you find yourself on your own. That's a different kettle of fish. And after a certain while, I got very depressed, and I ran out of money, and so I had to do something desperate. And I did remember that at college, that you were expected to do something second subject, and the subject I chose to do was pottery because I saw other people doing it. And the sort of background I come from, you do work in the daytime, and if you've got any, want to be a painter, do that as a hobby on your spare time. And that was very impressed upon me also, because when I started to, that was the instructions that I got. But that was difficult to get through because it did affect the way I walked. I used to find that I'd start working in much more comfortably in the evening. And in the daytime I really felt anxious that I was doing something I ought not to be doing. And I never really got over that until it came to a point where I couldn't go on like that anymore. And I remember that I'd been potter while I was dabbled in pottery while I was at Goldsmiths, and that it came back to me. I thought, well, this will get me out of my awful state of mind because I'll do something with my hands. I won't have to think so much. And so I got work in the pottery, and they said to me, well, you can come here if you like, you won't get any money for it. This seemed to ring a bell. And so I did. I started working at a pottery called the Odney Pottery in Berkshire.
Ceramics was something that he thought he might be able to do and make a bit more money. Yeah. And he wrote to some potteries, 6 or 7 potteries, and the only one that replied was Odney Pottery near Maidenhead. And they said, yeah, you can come and work for us as an apprentice, but we won't pay you to start with. So, and I think that was just before I was born, or about when I was born.
So even in those days there were apprentices?
Yeah, there were apprentices. Not paid.
Some people think that's a model.
I think after a while, you know, he quickly learned, you know, got quite good, and then they started paying him. But interestingly, that pottery, Odney Pottery, was a slipware pottery. They made pots for John Lewis. And he all the way through his career, he remembers that using slip like paint, you know, it's thick. Yes, and
that you were working in a medium called slip, which is this liquid clay in a creamy state, and you could pour it, you could let it stiffen, and you could paint it, you could palette knife it. I always wanted to be a palette knife painter because it seemed to be lots of body in it, and but I couldn't afford paint. So, but when it came to painting, to ceramics, I could afford the clay and put the clay on more or less as thick as I liked. That stage of pottery, being a potter, began to change to a point where I realized, well, I thought I realized, that I could do something with this medium, which doesn't necessarily mean that I had to give up what I had discovered with painting. But I was determined somehow or other that I would make this work, and that's where I am up to now, really.
And as I learnt pottery from him, it's been a way, when he was working with John Piper in his studio near Henley, it's been a way of rediscovering my own past, and a way of recognising what I learnt and absorbed by him, absorbed by myself from him. But it's also about what's different to me and the things that I'm interested in. He says, the vessel which encloses space, stores and preserves and protects. It is not important that it has any specific purpose, in fact better otherwise, for then the user can find his own, or leave it simply as a container for the reflections on the long, long line of prehistory whence pots first originated.
I found that porcelain, instead of being something that's always falling apart and you had to make thin, could be manipulated and while you were working with the hand, and it had a lot of sculptural possibilities. So I just wanted to think of it as another medium to be treated with as well as you can and inventively as possible. And after that, there was the question of throwing. That did involve throwing, of course, but I didn't make it a way of work, a line of work particularly. And from that, there's another stage one could work on, which a lot of other people I discovered were doing, was to throw and alter. So you made the pot form, and you let it soften up to a certain point, and then you did what you liked with it. You pushed, altered it, changed the shape or cut bits of it, and you made it another piece of work. So that period, what I was called was throw and alter, and I found again that a lot of other people were doing it, which was sort of disappointing. Really. But used to get any show of painting that I thought was worth looking at, I always went to. And this one's in Reading, and it was a show of the work by John Piper. And by way of making myself known to him, I said, "You interviewed me once." He said, "Yes, I was applying for to go to on a grant to go to Italy," and so he said, "Did you get it?" I thought that was rather sweet, really, because I didn't get it, of course. But that conversation started something. He said, "Well, I've got a son-in-law, he said, who I'd like to get some help making pottery and setting up a pottery." So I was met at this. So I went over to Fawley Bottom, where he lived, and I started to work, set up a pottery in his local, right next door to the house, really. And we were there for a little while, and then the pottery, the property just a little way up the lane became on free, and he bought it. And I said, "Well, I can help you much more if I worked on this place. I've just got more space." So he says, "Yes." That's quite a good idea. And from then on, I worked at Fawley Pottery from 1969 to 1983 or something like that.
And who was it when you first set up at Fawley Bottom? Was it Mark something?
Mark Donaldson, yeah.
Do you have any contact with him?
No, I'd love to meet him again. He was a really nice guy.
He was a nice chap.
And he did a lot of the mould making for your dad, and so I've just been finishing writing a talk. I remember going, because I used to go, that's when I learned to throw, was at Fawley.
Yeah.
And so I went there when...
What age were you then? You were quite young, weren't you?
17, yeah. I remember because I was learning to drive, so it must have been 17.
Right.
Yeah. And Mark Donaldson was there, and another chap from Hampshire College Bar. the two of them. So I used to go out there on a Saturday or weekends. So we'd do a couple of hours throwing, then we'd go up the pub at the top of the hill.
So it's also been wonderful for my two sons, Luke and Oliver, to have the opportunity to work with them over the last few weeks. Luke has been learning to throw and learning to glaze, and Oliver does video and photography, and he's made the short film that you may have seen already in the other room. So after my father died, I had this strong impulse to make things. After years of administrating the arts and facilitating artists to produce their own work, as a kind of homage to him, and also as a way of bringing some finality before all is lost, the studio is ended, and so on. And of course, it's been wonderful to present it here for Open Studios. It will be the last one we do in this house. So I had this idea, I wanted to do something in the pottery, but I didn't want to alter it drastically. So I've made some alterations, I've called them, in each of the three rooms in the pottery, kind of reordering things.
So if you look at the second row shelf down there, a lot of that porcelain is really mined in small-scale sculpture. And so that made me really, it gave me a sort of boost to say, yes, I can go towards sculpture. I don't want to call myself a ceramic sculptor. Some people do. I'm a bit frightened of those sort of terms. I just wanted to think of it as another medium.
I call this talk The Possibilities of Clay, and on one level it's about an exploration of clay as a material, just the elemental character of clay. So some of the things I was doing are just from rolling up sheets of clay in the throwing room, which are just really an expression of that feeling, rolling them out on the bench on pure metal oxides, and then picking them up with two hands and putting them down on the bench in one movement with minimal intervention, with minimal making involved. So that was one of the first things that I started doing. I didn't really want to get too thoughtful about it, really. It was just a way of using materials, but for some reason also seemed to express an interest that I've got in landscape.
We had a man who was supposed to be teaching, and he used to hold out a palette knife like this, hold out his thumb and a palette knife and put it against the object you were painting, and if you could make the two match, boom, Bob's your uncle, and you were there. And so that set me on a comfortably wrong path, because you didn't take long before you realised you weren't getting anywhere that way. Although some people make an extraordinarily clever career out of it, and doing things I could never have done in my life. But I did know there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was until I discovered Cézanne and Gauguin. I had learned from them two very different things. From Cézanne, obviously, how to put paint on the canvas without making it look too like a copy of nature, and so it looked like a structure, and the canvas was flat, and it stayed flat for Cézanne. It was allowed to go so much in and not too far, and then the eye caught you back again, so your eye was conducted around all the parts of the painting, so that you got this structural impression, and it was built up by little touches of paint that never left my mind. From Gauguin, I learned something he spoke or wrote. He was connected with a subject called synthesism that I didn't understand, but I found out what he meant was that you don't copy what you paint. Well, that's my interpretation of it. You find a way of getting it across by the way you paint, not by copying something. And that was a phrase that I resurrected. It's called "the character of the mark describes the object." I think that was the most elucidating statement I've ever read, to do with art. Instead of taking everything in a literal sort of way and trying to say that's what I'm doing, it might be poetry, it might be any form of art at all. What you're doing is finding a method of, what is the word, metaphor. You're trying to find a metaphor for what you're doing. You're not doing the thing you're looking at or reading. You're finding what it might be standing for. And that one thing has coloured my career ever since.
Somehow reminiscent of natural forms, which you'll see in the photographs which are in there as well. It was important for my father also that that kind of relationship with landscape, and he loved walking. In fact, he used to walk all around this area a lot. And when we were all young, he used to, when we took us on holidays to Wales, he'd make us walk to these beaches far away from where anybody else, and it would take miles and miles through bracken and brambles down cliffs to get somewhere where there wouldn't be any other people. But that and love of the landscape and love of walking was something that stuck with me ever since, really. So Geoffrey first started studio pottery at Aldermaston Pottery with Alan Smith in the late 1950s, making tin glazed maiolica, and there's a few examples in here. There's two small bowls right at the end on the shelf, and the second shelf down.
Tall was the Aldermaston Pottery, of us you might know, which was usually with Alan Smith there, using a different technique which is all about brushwork. And I thought, well, brushwork is a very useful skill, and so I worked along with that, and we worked quite a lot of time separately from with our own ideas, using the brushwork technique that Alan was using.
He did that for about 7 years, and then set up his first studio on his own in Padworth, which is also not far from here, just off the A4.
Yeah. And then I suddenly realised I had to stop. I had a bit of an illness, and I get out on my own. So I found somebody nearby, Padworth, and set up a stoneware pottery. The whole thing was that I'd gone step by step from one phase to one style, to one type of work to another. And all the time in the back of my mind I was aiming to be towards sculpture. And sculpture is a medium which is associated with stoneware. Well, the glaze in stoneware, the glaze doesn't rest on the top like it does in earthenware. It goes in and becomes part of the surface and doesn't interfere to the same extent. It improves the surface. And so that's where I started really working on my own.
And built there a kiln fired on sump oil from using sump oil from cars. That kiln worked on what they call reduction. So the atmosphere is starved of oxygen. The metal oxides behave in a different way, so you can create greens and reds from different oxides that you wouldn't be able to get in an electric kiln. He says of that, the elemental nature of this procedure completely took hold of me. The hissing of oil and steam, the rumbling flame responding to slight adjustments of air inside, and inside all the passive pots. And I remember it well, this big kiln. It seemed alive like a monster or a dragon, with flames coming out of the chimney and steam and smoke. And I think it was from that got me interested in pottery. But Geoffrey also at that stage saw limitations in ceramics, and he goes on to say this process had a time limit. The technique for its own sake cannot be completely satisfying. In a way, this has been what's driving his practice ever since. He began to realise that the elemental reduction firing that he'd been doing with this oil-fired kiln prevents a more explicit exploration of form and surface, which has preoccupied him for most of his career. So when he moved to the studio at Fawley Bottom and started his collaboration with John Piper, he began using an electric kiln, which he did up until he stopped working, because it's more controllable. But for me, the possibilities of clay are also about the limitations of clay. And in my mind, these limitations are caused by that firing process, because, as you probably know, when clay is fired, it changes chemically and becomes a different material, a hard material that will last for thousands of years in the ground. And so the potential for change in that object, that ceramic object, has ended once the clay has been fired. The possibilities to take that somewhere else have ended. It's fixed in time. And I think with other art forms, there still has potential in it. And I'm interested in change and the dynamics of change. And in some ways, ceramics seems to be contrary to that. Even though ceramics itself is a process of change, it's about physical and chemical change, but it's not a change that you're properly in control of. And I think that's what he found frustrating.
At that point, every time I moved house, yes, I had to change my outlook as well. I felt I had to anyway. So I went up to Etchingswell, which is where we found a suitable premises just over there. I went through another evolution. I had by now stopped glazing. I was still throwing and making. I was now using slips to make a surface. The surface and an object, very difficult. I always find that you have an object, and I was quite pleased with the object, but I could see it lacked a surface. And with your painting, you get a surface as you go along. And I thought that's what I want to do. And so it turned out that I threw and altered and made slip marks on it all over the place with the brush. And so by now I was no longer glazing, no longer throwing, and I had only one more step to take, and that step was to build by hand. I thought if I build by hand, I can at last shake off the what do I call it? The glue? No, not glue. The obligation. That's better. To be sort of being a potter, and so my work is simply carried on from there.
I'm interested in how using ceramics as a way of investigating landscape or architecture, or the social impact of what you're doing or what others are doing. And I don't particularly want to be a potter, and I don't particularly just want to use ceramics, although of course nowadays many artists do that. But I feel it could be one element in a practice that I would like to develop, and which might reflect on architecture and other things. And it's interesting that I've only really got into doing this since my father died, but I've been wanting to do it for some time, but of course circumstances haven't made it possible for one reason or another. But it has been wonderful to draw on his knowledge and his experience and his work that's, as you can see, is everywhere in the house and in the studio. And even when I wasn't making anything or doing anything here, I did talk to him quite a lot at different stages through his career. And if he was starting on something new or had made a new piece, he'd often ask me what I thought about it. So we'd have a discussion about the direction that we thought it was going in. And yeah, that's the kind of, in a sense, I've been on that journey with him.